We like to think we've mastered rest, with apps, pills, and gadgets, but medieval people might have had the real edge. They listened to their bodies. They flowed with the dark. They treated sleep not as a problem to fix, but as a rhythm to respect. So now we ask you, what if the future of sleep means looking backward? What would your nights look like without clocks, notifications, or pressure to sleep perfectly? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your sleep story. And if you learned something new today, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let's rediscover the past, one medieval mystery at a time. Imagine being jerked awake at 3 a.m. in a freezing, rat-infested hut, your mattress made of straw crawling with lice, and the only blanket being a damp wool sack. That's the image we usually conjure up when thinking about medieval sleep. No memory foam, no blackout curtains, no silence, no chance of restful REM cycles, right? But what if we've got it completely backward? Because here's the twist. Recent research into medieval sleep patterns suggests that people from the Middle Ages, not just nobles, but even peasants, may have slept just as well as their Viking counterparts. In fact, in some ways, maybe even better than we do today. And the reason why? It's not what you think. We're diving into a world before alarm clocks, screen-induced insomnia, or caffeine-fueled all-nighters. A world where human sleep didn't follow today's uninterrupted 8-hour model, but instead, something much more natural, what historians call segmented sleep. Back in the 13th and 14th centuries, most people didn't sleep through the night in one long block. They had a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by 1 or 2 hours of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this interval, they'd pray, tend to livestock, talk with family, even get frisky under the covers. Yes, really. Monastic records, medical texts, and even court documents mention this middle-of-the-night break as a normal part of life. Here's where it gets wild. According to historian Roger Kirch, whose research helped uncover this practice, segmented sleep was documented across Europe and beyond. People weren't suffering from insomnia. They were following a natural circadian rhythm aligned with seasonal light and darkness. And modern science, it actually backs this up. When participants in a sleep study were removed from artificial light and allowed to sleep on their own terms, many naturally adopted this two-sleep pattern. Turns out, our bodies may be wired for it. So, while we're guzzling melatonin and doom-scrolling at midnight, medieval folks were chilling by candlelight between two legit sleep phases. But let's not get too dreamy about it yet. Medieval sleep had some brutal downsides too, especially if you were poor. In England, many peasants slept in open-hall homes with dirt floors, no privacy, and the constant snoring of extended family members, or worse, the coughs of someone dying from the plague. In winter, your breath might freeze on the inside of your blanket. In summer, the stench of unwashed bodies and chamber pots wasn't exactly conducive to sweet dreams. Oh, and there were no pajamas. Most people just slept naked or in the same linen shirt they wore all day. Fleas and lice. Ubiquitous. And if you were lucky enough to have a bed, it probably meant sharing it with multiple people. Parents often slept with their children. Servants bunked with each other. Travelers shared mattresses at inns. Sleep was communal, functional, and full of noise. Compare that to the Vikings, whose longhouses had raised wooden platforms covered in animal skins and straw. They used furs for warmth and slept around central hearths that offered both heat and security. Some even built bed closets, partially enclosed wooden sleeping areas that gave a degree of privacy. And yet, medieval Europeans in towns and manors were doing something similar by the 12th century, building box beds or curtained sleeping niches to shut out cold and prying eyes. But here's the kicker. While Viking society valued sleep as part of strength and health, medieval thinkers spiritualized it. Sleep was tied to morality. Too much of it was sloth, a deadly sin. Too little, and you risked your soul in weakened prayer. Monks followed tight sleep schedules, sometimes getting only 3 or 4 hours before a midnight service. In contrast, farmers, who followed natural daylight, might sleep more in winter and less in summer. Total sleep time flexed with the seasons. Let's put this into a modern perspective. Today, we use apps to monitor our sleep quality. We pop pills to fall asleep faster. Yet rates of chronic insomnia and anxiety are through the roof. People are now paying hundreds for sleep retreats to relearn how to rest properly. Meanwhile, in the medieval world, your sleep was dictated by sunrise, sunset, and survival. No blue light, no binge watching. Your biggest nighttime interruption? Probably a rooster or a neighbor's coughing fit. And shockingly, that's not necessarily worse. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Sleep Research found that pre-industrial societies often slept less than modern people, but more deeply. Without light pollution, their melatonin levels spiked naturally. Their sleep wasn't longer, but it was more restorative. This challenges the assumption that modern sleep is superior just because it's uninterrupted. Medieval people also understood some things about sleep we think are new. For instance, documents from the 14th century mention the dangers of sleeping too much after a big meal or when drunk, both known to disrupt modern REM cycles. Medical texts from the period even advised on optimal sleep posture, room orientation, and bed construction. Of course, these were written by scholars and physicians, not peasants. But the awareness was there. Still, let's not gloss over the raw, gritty reality. Rural peasants often shared their space with animals, especially in winter. Chickens, goats, even pigs might be brought indoors for warmth. That meant night noises, smells, and the occasional hoof to the face. In urban tenements, thin walls separated you from drunken brawls or crying infants. And let's not forget the rats, ubiquitous in cities, burrowing into that hay-stuffed mattress you hadn't changed in months. Yet somehow, despite all this, the human body adapted. People fell asleep quickly, often from sheer exhaustion. Physical labor from dawn to dusk left little room for insomnia. And the segmented model allowed for natural midnight resets that modern insomniacs might envy. Sleep wasn't about luxury, it was about function, it was survival. Now here's where it gets even stranger. In some places, especially in religious communities, people believed dreams had divine meaning. The Book of Dreams, a popular medieval text, claimed that dreaming of rivers meant wealth, while dreaming of birds could signal betrayal. Sleep was a doorway to prophecy, to sin, or to healing. This spiritual dimension made sleep sacred, and sometimes dangerous. Which brings us back to the central irony. Today, in our hyper-technologized world with smart beds and sleep tracking rings, we're struggling to do what medieval people managed nightly: fall asleep and stay asleep. We fear silence. They embraced it. We dread the dark. They structured their lives around it. So the real shocker isn't that medieval folks had segmented sleep. It's that, in many ways, they were doing it better. It's one thing to say medieval people had decent sleep. It's another to understand how they pulled it off in environments that, by modern standards, sound like pure nightmares. Because when you take a closer look at how medieval homes were built, who people slept with, and what cultural forces shaped their rest, a darker truth creeps in. Sleep back then wasn't just a personal act, it was a social battleground. Let's start with architecture. The average peasant home in 13th century Europe was a one-room hut, with a hearth in the center and barely enough space for cooking, storing tools, and sleeping. There were no bedrooms. Privacy was unheard of. Instead of each person having a separate bed, families often shared straw mattresses spread out on wooden planks or directly on the dirt floor. Imagine sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your parents, siblings, and maybe even your livestock. Now add in the smells of old stew, wet boots, and unwashed feet. Cozy, right? Wealthier households had it better, but not by much. Manor houses might have a solar, a private upper room reserved for the lord and lady. But even they didn't always sleep alone. Servants sometimes bunked at the foot of the bed, either for warmth or protection. Children slept nearby. And in noble households, the bedroom was often a public space, used for meetings, writing, even receiving guests. Contrast that with Viking longhouses. Though communal, they were cleverly designed for warmth and efficiency. Raised sleeping platforms helped avoid floor dampness. Central hearths provided steady heat. Thick animal pelts served as blankets and insulation. And because longhouses often housed extended families, Vikings too had to navigate the chaos of shared sleep, but they did it with intentional design. Medieval Europeans weren't always so lucky. In cities, especially as populations exploded during the High Middle Ages, sleeping conditions got tighter. Tenements sprang up, packed with families in multi-story wooden buildings. Fire was a constant danger. Noise from streets, taverns, and churches echoed through the night. And because people lived so close together, sickness spread fast. Tuberculosis, plague, and respiratory infections turned sleep into a dangerous vulnerability. And then there was the church, ever present and always watching. By the 12th century, the church had firm opinions about sleep. Too much was laziness. Too little might lead to temptation. And sleep was the perfect moment for sin to creep in. Monasteries, for example, regulated sleep down to the minute. Monks would be awakened in pitch darkness to chant prayers, then return to short, broken slumber. It wasn't restful, it was regimented. Secular folks weren't exempt either. Medieval guides warned against sleeping after sunrise, which was said to cause disease and spiritual decay. Dreaming of carnal pleasure? That wasn't just a guilty fantasy, it could be grounds for confession. A good Christian was meant to sleep moderately, rise early, and remain alert to God's presence, even in their dreams. It created a tension we still feel today, sleep as necessity versus sleep as indulgence. Now layer in social status, and things get even messier. For nobles, luxurious beds with feather mattresses, imported linens, and carved wooden frames were both symbols of wealth and tools of control. A guest allowed to share your bed wasn't just being hosted, they were being shown favor, status, and political alignment. Bed sharing wasn't just practical, it was strategic. In fact, medieval courts used shared beds to seal alliances. Two nobles sleeping in the same bed signified trust. Kings and their attendants often shared quarters. Even in royal families, siblings might share beds well into adolescence. Not out of necessity, but out of custom. But for peasants, bed sharing wasn't optional, it was survival. Take the infamous bedgowns, loose linen garments people slept in. These were passed down, mended, and shared among family members. The poor couldn't afford dedicated sleepwear. And mattresses, often nothing more than straw packed in cloth sacks, called ticks. These were home to mites, fleas, and all manner of pests. You didn't just sleep with your siblings. You slept with insects. Every single night. Now here's a twist. Despite these conditions, some aspects of medieval sleep were surprisingly advanced. For example, there's evidence that people tried to regulate sleep temperature by sleeping with hot stones wrapped in cloth or placing ember-filled pans under the bed. In colder regions, sleeping in cupboard beds, enclosed wooden boxes, helped trap body heat. These were popular in the Low Countries and parts of France. And believe it or not, sleep hygiene wasn't totally neglected. 14th century medical texts advised washing the feet before bed to improve circulation and sleep quality. It was believed that foul odors and unclean skin disrupted dreams. Doctors even recommended certain herbs, like lavender and valerian, to induce better rest. Sound familiar? Those are still in our sleep teas today. Yet all of this took place in a world where sleep was never guaranteed. Seasonal shifts massively impacted rest. In summer, longer daylight hours meant less sleep overall, sometimes only 5 or 6 hours. In winter, people might rest closer to 10. But remember, this wasn't deep, unbroken slumber. It was fragmented, interrupted, and communal. Even your sleep schedule might be dictated by your job. Bakers started their work around 2 or 3 a.m. Night watchmen patrolled the streets. Shepherds tended to animals through the night. These nocturnal roles forced people into inverted cycles, up when others slept, asleep when the village stirred. And yet, the rhythm of segmented sleep allowed some flexibility. You could nap in the early evening, wake at midnight, work, then return to sleep. Compare that to modern shift work, linked to heart disease, anxiety, and sleep disorders. While we think of medieval life as chaotic and disorganized, their flexible sleep cycles may have actually reduced stress in ways we're only beginning to understand. Still, there's no denying the violence of vulnerability. Nighttime was prime time for danger. Home invasions, drunken brawls, even witch-hunting mobs happened under the cover of darkness. Many slept with weapons nearby. In urban centers, curfews were enforced to reduce crime. Bells rang at sundown, and those caught outdoors after dark without reason risked arrest, or worse. And yet, people adapted. They created rituals around sleep. Certain prayers were recited before lying down. Charms were hung above beds. Children were told stories to soothe them. And in rural villages, entire families fell asleep together, soothed by the crackling fire, the lowing of animals, and the silence of a world with no electricity. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't luxurious. but it was human. Modern sleep, for all its perks, is deeply individualistic. White noise machines, blackout curtains, separate bedrooms, even separate beds for couples. We isolate ourselves for optimal rest, and still struggle. Meanwhile, medieval people embraced sleep as a shared experience. They didn't fight the night. They made peace with it. But that peace didn't last forever. As we'll explore in Part 3, something began to shift, both culturally and architecturally, that would unravel the segmented sleep system. Urbanization, artificial lighting, and changing moral codes would reshape the medieval night into something far more controlled and far less restful. Everything about medieval sleep seemed to work, at least by their standards. The segmented structure, the communal mindset, the seasonal flexibility, it all fit together like clockwork. But just as this rhythm became a part of daily life, the world began to change, and not in ways anyone could have predicted. The shift didn't start in bedrooms. It started in cities. As the High Middle Ages gave way to the Late Middle Ages, Europe saw explosive urban growth. Trade routes intensified. Guilds flourished. Markets became permanent fixtures. And with cities came new architecture, multi-storied townhouses, inns, tenements, monasteries expanding vertically rather than out. For the first time, people were living in close quarters not because of family ties or farming communities, but because of economic necessity. This crowded lifestyle brought pressure and anxiety into places that had once been intimate. And nowhere did this show more clearly than in the way people slept. In larger cities like London, Paris, and Lubeck, sleeping arrangements became precarious. You might rent a bed, a bench, or even just a spot on the floor. Entire industries arose around bed space for hire, where poor workers crammed into tiny rooms, sometimes 6 or 7 to a bed. And with so many strangers sleeping together, trust collapsed. Theft, sexual assault, and violent disputes became frequent. Here's the pivot. Segmented sleep began to fracture. Why? Because the environment no longer supported it. Imagine trying to rise at midnight to say a prayer or sit by the fire when your bed was the cold corner of a shared room in a boarding house. People began forcing themselves into longer, uninterrupted sleep windows, if only to protect their possessions or avoid bothering others. What had once been natural was now inconvenient. Then came the killer, artificial lighting. By the 15th century, candle production had increased dramatically. Wealthier households began using tallow candles and oil lamps more regularly. Monasteries and noble homes were already familiar with night illumination, but now, light was creeping into urban middle-class homes, too. At first, it seemed like a luxury. Being able to read, write, or work after dark. Revolutionary. But the long-term consequences were subtle and profound. Exposure to light after sunset began suppressing melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep. People stayed up later. Sleep became shallower. And the natural break between first and second sleep? It faded. This isn't just historical speculation, it's backed by research. Roger Kirch, the same historian who uncovered medieval segmented sleep, found that mentions of first sleep and second sleep in diaries, letters, and literature begin to decline after the 1600s, when artificial lighting becomes widespread. The modern model of sleeping through the night slowly took over, not because it was better, but because it fit the new world. Even more dramatic was the influence of changing moral codes. The medieval church had always policed sleep, but by the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, new anxieties emerged. Middle-of-the-night wakefulness, once seen as normal, was increasingly linked to idleness and temptation. Clerics warned that people who wandered at night, even inside their homes, risked demonic influence. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum described witches casting spells in the dead of night, when souls were most vulnerable. This moral panic reshaped nighttime behavior. People avoided being seen awake between midnight and dawn. Some households began enforcing strict rules: no fire after sundown, no talking, no light, no movement. Bedrooms became zones of enforced silence, not sacred rest. Compare that to earlier centuries, when a person might rise between sleeps to pray, visit a neighbor, or tell stories. What had been a communal, flexible ritual now morphed into a private, controlled routine. This wasn't an accident, it was social engineering. And yet, the contradictions multiplied. Medical texts still recommended segmented sleep as ideal. But social expectations now punished those who practiced it. This created a new kind of sleep stress, trying to force the body into a block of uninterrupted sleep it didn't naturally want. Sound familiar? Fast forward to today. We call it insomnia. In fact, some sleep researchers believe that modern insomnia is, in part, a symptom of us fighting our evolutionary rhythm. Waking up at 2 a.m. doesn't mean something's wrong. It means our ancestors used that time to rest, reflect, or work. But instead of embracing the wakefulness, we panic. We pop pills. We blame ourselves. And ironically, we're recreating the same pressures that began during the late medieval shift: work deadlines, social surveillance, fear of vulnerability at night. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The wealthy continued to innovate in sleep comfort. By the 15th century, elite homes featured four-poster beds with heavy curtains, not just for privacy, but for warmth and darkness. Some were so ornate they were inherited as heirlooms. Mattresses were now filled with feathers or wool instead of straw. Beds were elevated, symbolic, and covered in layers of imported fabric. Sleep had become a status symbol. In fact, the English phrase, "to sleep tight," may derive from the practice of tightening the ropes under a mattress frame before bed to ensure firmness and comfort. The pivot point had fully arrived. Sleep became a class marker. The poor slept communally, on straw, often in shifts. The rich slept alone, in silence, behind drawn curtains and locked doors. Even the act of dreaming took on different meanings. Theologians began dissecting dreams with surgical precision. Was that angelic vision really divine, or a trick of the devil? Physicians started mapping dream symbols to physical ailments. Sleep, once viewed as a spiritual opening, became a battleground of fear and guilt. So what's the takeaway? The natural, fluid, communal sleep that once helped medieval people thrive was now under siege, from architecture, economy, morality, and technology. And in its place grew the rigid, individualized, sleep-on-demand model we now consider normal. But here's the twist: what we call normal may be historically brand new, and biologically unnatural. That's not just fascinating. That's unnerving. We'll see how this sleep transition didn't just affect the body, but reshaped time itself. From clock towers to curfews, bells to bedtime prayers, medieval society redefined how night should be spent, and who got to decide. The slow collapse of segmented sleep wasn't just a shift in bedtime routine. It triggered a full-scale transformation in how medieval people perceived time, labor, morality, and control. Sleep, once flexible and forgiving, became a site of pressure and performance. And at the heart of this transformation, the clock. Not just any clock. We're talking about the rise of mechanical timekeeping, a revolutionary technology that would upend not just sleep, but the medieval psyche itself. Before the 14th century, time was measured by the sun, seasons, and the pealing of church bells. Days weren't carved into precise hours but into canonical blocks: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nones, vespers, and compline. Sleep fit fluidly into this cycle. You didn't go to bed at 10 p.m. You went to sleep after compline, when darkness made work impossible. But as monasteries installed the first mechanical clocks, massive, gear-driven machines that rang bells with unrelenting precision, the concept of objective time took hold. By the mid-14th century, town clock towers began appearing in cities across Europe. For the first time, hours became standardized. Work schedules tightened. Bells rang not just to mark prayer, but to demand presence, labor, and obedience. And sleep, it had to adjust. Imagine living in a world where your internal rhythm is slowly crushed by external chimes. Where your moment of midnight reflection is interrupted by a bell telling you it's time to move, pray, or stop. Where your ability to nap in daylight becomes stigmatized as sloth. This was the psychological impact of mechanical time. It colonized the night. And with it came consequences. Take the workforce. In guild-controlled towns like Florence and Ghent, workers were now expected to clock in at dawn and stay active until a prescribed hour. Oversleeping was a punishable offense. Employers began keeping records of punctuality. Sleep became a liability, not a necessity. Even in the countryside, where the sun still reigned, landlords and manorial courts imposed tighter expectations. Tenants were fined for missing tasks. The church pushed morning masses earlier. The concept of the lazy laborer emerged, fueling stereotypes that still persist today. Now let's talk about fear. In a society where most crimes happened after dark, being caught awake at night became suspicious. Towns passed ordinances banning night walking. Curfews, literally from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, forced families to extinguish flames at sundown to prevent house fires and limit movement. That middle-of-the-night pause between sleeps? Now it could get you arrested. So people began hiding their wakefulness. They whispered. They lit single candles. They avoided windows. This fear reshaped family dynamics. Instead of communal warmth, nighttime became a tense, paranoid silence, especially in urban settings where patrols roamed the streets. Contrast this with the Vikings. Their homes lacked mechanical clocks. Their seasonal rhythms still ruled. While the rest of Europe was submitting to the tyranny of bells and laws, Scandinavian sleep stayed freer, at least for a while. Viking sagas rarely mention precise hours. Time was still personal, flexible, narrative-driven. But even they weren't immune forever. By the late Middle Ages, trade and Christianity spread clock-based routines to the Nordic world too. The shift was global, relentless, and irreversible. Here's where things escalate. By the 15th century, the growing merchant class adopted a new virtue: efficiency. Sleep began to be seen as wasteful. You were supposed to rise early, labor constantly, and redeem the time. Protestant reformers in the 16th century would take this even further, turning rest into guilt. Martin Luther famously wrote, "Satan never sleeps, so why should we?" This wasn't just theology, it was economic ideology. The groundwork for capitalism was being laid, and sleep got in the way. Segmented rest, flexible nights, dreams as divine messages? All of it was seen as irrational and unproductive. The body was no longer a spiritual vessel, it was a machine, and machines don't rest unless they're broken. Nowhere is this clearer than in the treatment of the poor. Charity handbooks began including sleep-related judgments. Sleeps too much became shorthand for laziness, poverty, and moral failure. Workhouses in the following centuries would cut sleep hours to squeeze more productivity from residents. The poor weren't just criminalized, they were dehumanized through their sleep. Meanwhile, the elite went in the opposite direction. They embraced sleep not as necessity, but as status. Royalty and nobles spent lavishly on bedroom decor. Velvet curtains, imported silk sheets, and embroidered nightclothes weren't just about comfort, they were statements. I can afford to sleep in luxury, therefore I am powerful. Four-poster beds became thrones of the night. Bedrooms evolved into private palaces. The act of retiring to bed became theatrical. You didn't just sleep, you performed sleep. Visitors might be invited into your bedchamber to watch you prepare for slumber, surrounded by servants, candles, and whispered prayers. This luxury was out of reach for 99% of the population. But the idea trickled down. Even middle-class families began mimicking the elite by dedicating private rooms for sleep, a revolutionary concept in a world where most people had slept communally for centuries. This marked the final death knell of the medieval model. Segmented sleep didn't just vanish. It was buried beneath layers of moral judgment, technological disruption, and class-based pressure. And yet, in rural corners of Europe, echoes remained. Peasants in isolated villages kept rising in the middle of the night to tend fires, say prayers, or check on livestock. Oral traditions carried stories of first sleep and second sleep well into the 17th century. The land remembered, even when the cities forgot. Today, sleep scientists looking at these patterns see a historical tragedy. What we lost wasn't just a quirky medieval habit, it was a rhythm that matched our biology. A system shaped by moonlight, not marketing. By seasons, not schedules. And yet, this is where the crescendo builds, because despite all our advances, climate-controlled rooms, orthopedic pillows, sleep trackers, we're still chasing what medieval peasants had naturally: rest. We'll reflect on this full arc. From segmented sleep to sleepless ambition, from natural rhythm to artificial pressure, we'll ask the question: what did we really lose when we abandoned the medieval night? We began this journey expecting squalor, chaos, and sleepless misery. After all, what could medieval people possibly know about rest that we don't? No memory foam, no blackout curtains, No idea what REM sleep even was. But the more we dug into their world, the clearer it became. They didn't just sleep, they thrived on rhythms we've forgotten. And that's what stings the most. Because at some point between candlelight and LED screens, between the monastery bell and the morning alarm, we broke something. We inherited the worst parts of the medieval shift: control, guilt, sleepless ambition, and left behind the very things that made sleep human, communal, and restorative. Segmented sleep was more than a quirk. It was a biological rhythm, shaped by natural light, labor, and rest, not by fear of laziness or the ticking of a clock. That middle-of-the-night interval wasn't wasted time. It was reflective time. Time to pray, to think, to talk, to dream consciously. Time modern life doesn't allow us. And let's not forget how connected they were. Sleep wasn't isolated. It was shared. Families slept together. Neighbors heard each other. Entire villages rose and rested in cycles that respected the seasons. It was messy, noisy, sometimes lice-ridden. But it was human. Modern sleep, for all its precision, feels sterile. We isolate ourselves with soundproof rooms, blackout blinds, and pharmaceutical interventions. We chase rest like a lost lover, always just out of reach. And when we can't sleep, we blame ourselves. What would a medieval farmer say about that? Probably nothing. He'd be up in the middle of the night, tending the fire and letting his mind wander. No panic, no shame. Even the Vikings, often painted as brutes, understood rest as part of balance. They wrapped themselves in furs, curled around hearths, and built box beds not just for warmth, but for mental security. They knew what we're only beginning to relearn. Feeling safe is half the battle when it comes to sleeping well. There's a modern irony in all this. We're now turning back to practices the medieval world never abandoned. Warm foot baths before bed? Check. Herbal teas with valerian and lavender? Check. Controlled darkness and cold rooms to mimic pre-industrial nights? Check. Even biphasic sleep is making a comeback in sleep science circles, praised as more natural and restorative than the single 8-hour stretch. In other words, the more we study sleep, the more medieval we become. And that's not just about the body, it's about time. Because if sleep is a lens for how we value time, then we've gone from a world where rest was integrated into life to one where it's squeezed in as an afterthought. Sleep used to be a sacred pause. Now it's a hurdle. Something to optimize. And yet, the clock keeps ticking. Even in medieval times, there were warning signs. Clock towers, curfews, candlelight. The seeds of our modern struggle were already being planted. People began questioning the need for first sleep and second sleep. They stayed up later. They tried to cram more into their waking hours. The change didn't happen overnight, but it did happen at night. We often romanticize the past, but this isn't about nostalgia. It's about reality. Yes, they slept in filth sometimes. Yes, disease, cold, and hunger were constant threats. But they didn't fear sleep. They didn't see it as weakness. It wasn't a time thief. It was a part of the cycle. So what did we lose? We lost the communal aspect, the sense that sleep is something shared, not hidden. We lost natural alignment with light and dark. We lost freedom from clocks, from rigid expectations, from performance. We lost the space in between, the quiet hour between dreams where nothing was required of you but to simply be awake. And we gained pills, anxiety, alarms, hustle culture, productivity hacks, sleep tech that promises rest but rarely delivers, a world that makes you feel guilty for closing your eyes. The next time you wake up at 2:30 a.m., don't panic. Don't grab your phone. Don't scold yourself for being awake. Instead, try doing what a medieval monk, peasant, or Viking might have done. Sit quietly. Think. Breathe. Pray, if that's your thing. Let your body tell you when it's ready to sleep again. Maybe the past isn't something to escape, but something to recover. And maybe, just maybe, people from medieval times weren't so far behind us after all. We love to think of ourselves as the most advanced generation, but when it comes to sleep, medieval people might have been the real pros. They didn't need apps or alarms. They trusted nature, honored the night, and embraced rhythms we've since forgotten. Here at Medieval Daily, we dig into the surprising truths behind the myths, because medieval life wasn't just darker and dirtier, it was smarter in ways we're only now starting to understand. So what do you think? Could segmented sleep make a comeback? Would you ever try waking up in the middle of the night on purpose? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more no-nonsense medieval history, without the fantasy fluff, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and join us here at Medieval Daily, where the past isn't just old, it's shockingly relevant.